Clara had always cherished quiet afternoons, the kind that allowed her to feel the sun spilling lazily across her small apartment and the faint hum of life outside her window. The soft rhythm of passing footsteps and distant voices carrying a comforting sense of continuity. She spent her days managing the little bookstore she had inherited from her aunt, a place where the scent of old paper mingled with the faint aroma of coffee from the corner cafe, and where she found solace among shelves stacked with stories of love, adventure, and the myriad human experiences she had always loved exploring. On this particular day, the sky was gray, and the rain had been falling steadily, drumming against the windows in a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to echo the quiet longing in her own heart, a longing she often couldn't put into words, a gentle ache for connection, for a spark of something extraordinary to break through the calm monotony of her routine. She was arranging new arrivals in the back room, carefully sorting the books by author and genre, her fingers tracing the worn spines with the same reverence she reserved for old friends, when the bell above the door dingled, startling her slightly and drawing her gaze to the entrance. There, standing in a haze of rain, soaked to the bone, was Adrian, the friend of her nephew, a young man she had only met once at a family gathering, but whose presence now felt somehow significant, charged with a quiet energy that made her heart skip unexpectedly. He looked hesitant, as if unsure of whether he had the right to be there, and yet there was an earnestness in his eyes, a kind of vulnerability that pulled at her instincts to be gentle and welcoming. "I'm so sorry to bother you," he said, his voice low and careful, almost hesitant, carrying a note of apology and an unspoken hope that she would receive him kindly, "but I needed to return something I borrowed last week." Clara blinked, trying to mask the flutter of emotion that rose unbidden in her chest, and smiled softly, a simple gesture that invited him in and allowed the warmth of the bookstore to wash over him, a refuge from the rain and perhaps from whatever had led him here. As he stepped inside, shaking off water and glancing around with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness, she noticed the way his shoulders tensed briefly and relaxed, the small details of a person who was both composed and yet clearly carrying some inner tension, and she felt a surprising pull, a mixture of intrigue and tenderness, the sort of subtle emotional stirrings that can sneak up on a person in the most ordinary of moments. She led him to the back counter, accepting the book he offered with a polite nod, her fingers brushing briefly against his in a moment so fleeting it might have gone unnoticed, and yet the touch carried a warmth that lingered in the air, unspoken and potent, a small thread connecting them in a way that neither fully acknowledged but both silently felt. As they exchanged a few words about the book, its author, and the story contained within, Clara found herself listening more intently than she often allowed herself to listen to strangers, noticing the cadence of his voice, the slight hesitations that betrayed his thoughtfulness, the flicker of a smile that appeared when he spoke of something he loved, and she realized, with a quiet astonishment, that her heart was responding to this chance encounter in a way that felt almost preposterous but entirely real. Time seemed to stretch in those few moments, the rain outside forming a gentle curtain between them and the rest of the world, isolating this unexpected meeting in a bubble of quiet intensity. And Clara felt a strange combination of anticipation and nervousness, the sort of emotion she had long believed belonged only in novels or distant memories of youth, yet here it was, alive in the bookstore, between her and a young man who had stepped through the door purely by circumstance. She tried to steady herself, reminding her mind that Adrian was, after all, her nephew's friend, a young man with his own life, and yet the feeling refused to be dismissed, a quiet tug of curiosity and longing that whispered possibilities she had never allowed herself to entertain, and she found herself asking small, tentative questions, noting the light in his eyes when he responded with honesty and subtle humor, feeling the slow rise of a bond that seemed impossible to define in so brief a time but undeniable in its impact. The minutes passed, filled with the gentle murmur of the rain, the soft rustle of pages from nearby shelves, and the occasional distant footstep outside, a world moving on oblivious to the fragile thread forming between them, and Clara realized, almost with a jolt, that this unexpected encounter had shifted something inside her, a door she had long kept closed nudged ajar, revealing emotions she thought were long dormant, a mixture of intrigue, hope, and a strange, exhilarating tension that left her breath catching just slightly each time he spoke. As Adrian prepared to leave, shaking off the last drops of rain and offering a polite, slightly awkward farewell, Clara found herself hesitating, wishing there was a reason for him to stay. Some pretext that would allow her to prolong the moment without seeming forward or improper, and she felt the subtle sting of disappointment when the door closed behind him, leaving her standing amid the quiet stacks of books, the scent of paper and rain mingling in the air, a lingering warmth where his presence had just been. She realized, with a sense of both trepidation and excitement, that life had a curious way of surprising a person when they least expected it, that even the most ordinary days could suddenly carry the weight of possibility, and that a single, fleeting encounter had the power to stir the heart in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. In the hours that followed, Clara found herself replaying the moment again and again, remembering the way his gaze had met hers, the gentle inflection in his voice, the nervous yet earnest way he had navigated a space that was new to him, and she felt a curious mixture of longing and anticipation, a desire to see him again paired with the unspoken understanding that something significant had begun, though neither of them could yet define it. The bookstore felt different after he left, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the small spark of connection, the gentle possibility of a story unfolding, and Clara moved about her tasks with a renewed energy, her thoughts drifting to Adrian with a softness she hadn't experienced in years, a warmth that threaded through her normally calm routine, a gentle reminder that the world could still surprise her in ways both tender and profound. That evening, as she closed the doors and stepped into the quiet drizzle outside, Clara felt a quiet shiver of anticipation, a sense that this was only the beginning, that the unexpected moment that had disrupted her ordinary day had changed something fundamental within her, and that the thread of connection she had felt might just weave a new chapter in her life, one filled with subtle tension, quiet longing, and the gentle possibility of romance, a story that had begun not with grand gestures or dramatic events, but with the simple, profound arrival of someone who had unknowingly touched her heart in a way nothing else had in years. And though she told herself it was just a brief encounter, just an ordinary moment that might never repeat, Clara knew, deep down, that life had shifted subtly yet irrevocably, that the universe had a way of nudging hearts together at precisely the right time, and that she would forever remember the day a young man, drenched in rain and carrying nothing more than a returned book, walked into her life and left it subtly, irrevocably changed. Over the following days, Adrian found reasons to visit Clara's bookstore more often, sometimes claiming he needed a book recommendation, other times wanting to discuss a story he had recently read, but in truth, it seemed that the visits were as much about seeing her as they were about anything else, and Clara, despite herself, found her heart racing each time she heard the familiar jingle of the doorbell announcing his arrival. Their conversations flowed naturally, effortless and warm, as if they had known each other for far longer than the few fleeting encounters they had shared, and she discovered small details about him that made him even more intriguing. The way his eyes lit up when he described a favorite novel, the gentle lilt in his voice when he laughed, the slight hesitation before he shared something personal, a hesitation that made her want to listen even more closely and to understand him in a way no one else seemed to. Each meeting left an echo in her chest, a quiet flutter that she tried to ignore but could not, a feeling that seemed to grow stronger with every word exchanged, a subtle tension that threaded through the ordinary rhythm of their conversations like an invisible current drawing them closer. One afternoon, as Clara was stacking new arrivals near the front of the store, Adrian approached with a careful smile, carrying a worn notebook and a book in his hands, his fingers slightly trembling as he handed them over to her, and she noticed a shadow in his eyes that hinted at something unspoken, a quiet vulnerability that both intrigued and concerned her. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, trying to mask the worry in her voice with a gentle smile, and he hesitated, glancing away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "It's complicated," he admitted, his words simple but carrying weight, a hint of a burden he had not shared with anyone else, and Clara felt a pang of empathy, a sudden urge to comfort him, to bridge the distance that his carefully maintained composure had so far preserved. They lingered near the shelves, surrounded by stacks of books that smelled of history and imagination, and for a moment, time seemed to slow, the soft hum of the city outside fading into the background as they existed in a bubble of quiet intimacy, sharing more than words, a connection that neither could fully articulate yet both felt deeply, a bond that began to grow in the spaces between sentences, in the pauses, in the small smiles and glances that spoke volumes. As they discussed the story Adrian had been reading, Clara noticed the way his brow furrowed when he was particularly invested, the subtle gestures that betrayed a sensitive and thoughtful nature, and she found herself drawn in, imagining the life he had led, the experiences that had shaped him, and the dreams he held quietly in his heart, dreams he may never have shared with anyone else, yet now felt safe enough to hint at in her presence. Days turned into a rhythm, a gentle pattern of meetings and conversations, and Clara began to anticipate each arrival with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, a feeling she had not experienced in years, and she realized that her heart, which had grown accustomed to solitude and careful routines, was slowly opening to the possibility of something more, a tenderness that she had almost forgotten existed, a longing that intertwined with the joy of simple companionship. One evening, as the light outside dimmed and rain began to patter gently against the windows, Adrian lingered longer than usual, his voice quieter, more reflective, and Clara sensed the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing between them. She wanted to ask, to understand, but the hesitation in his eyes and the careful restraint in his posture suggested a story he was not yet ready to tell, a part of him he feared revealing, and her heart ached with a mixture of anticipation and worry, the kind of longing that made even the simplest gestures, like handing over a book or sharing a laugh, feel charged with significance. In that quiet, dimly lit bookstore, surrounded by the scent of paper and the faint sound of rain, Clara felt a closeness growing between them that was at once exhilarating and terrifying, a delicate balance of emotions that seemed almost too fragile for the outside world yet too profound to ignore, and she found herself wondering if he could sense the same connection, the same subtle thread weaving them together in a way that neither had named but both felt. Their hands brushed once while passing a notebook, a fleeting touch that sent a small shiver through her, and she caught herself staring at him a moment longer than necessary, noting the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet strength beneath his vulnerability, and the way his presence seemed to fill the room without him saying a word, a magnetic pull that left her breathless yet yearning for more. Adrian, too, seemed affected, his voice catching slightly when he laughed, his glances lingering longer than casual politeness required, and Clara realized that the connection they were building was mutual, a gentle unfolding of trust, affection, and a shared understanding that was rare and precious, and she felt the weight of it deeply, a tender ache that she welcomed even as it made her cautious. One rainy afternoon, as the world outside was obscured by sheets of gray drizzle, Adrian confided something personal, a worry that had been troubling him for weeks, and Clara listened intently, offering words of comfort that were simple yet heartfelt, her hand resting lightly over his in a gesture of reassurance, and in that intimate moment, the invisible barrier between them seemed to shift, the tension and longing coalescing into a quiet, profound closeness that neither had experienced with anyone else. They spoke of dreams and fears, of moments that had shaped them, and of hopes for the future, their voices blending with the gentle rhythm of rain on the windows, creating a cocoon of understanding that felt sacred, a space where hearts could speak honestly without fear or judgment, and Clara felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken, for the arrival of someone who could see her fully and yet still choose to stay. And yet, even in the warmth of these moments, there lingered a shadow, a hesitation in Adrian that suggested unspoken challenges or past heartbreaks, a complexity that made Clara's heart ache with concern and longing, a desire to be a source of light for him without overstepping, to be present without pushing too far, to nurture the fragile connection growing between them with patience and care. She found herself looking forward to each day with renewed energy, eager for his visits, and yet painfully aware that the depth of her feelings might remain unacknowledged, that the path forward was uncertain, and that even small gestures could carry the weight of emotional risk. And in this quiet tension, in the delicate balance of longing and restraint, Clara began to understand that life had a way of offering moments of connection when least expected, that hearts could recognize each other in a fleeting glance, and that even the simplest interactions, like discussing a book, sharing a laugh, or offering a hand in reassurance, could grow into something transformative, a quiet unfolding of affection, trust, and the possibility of love. As Adrian prepared to leave once more, the rain outside blurring the edges of the city into soft gray shadows, Clara felt a pang of bittersweet anticipation, the ache of wanting more mingling with the tender hope that these encounters would continue, That the fragile thread linking them would strengthen over time, and that perhaps, in the gentle unfolding of ordinary days, extraordinary moments could blossom into a lasting, profound connection, the kind that changes hearts in ways subtle but enduring. She watched him step into the drizzle, the bell above the door gingling a soft farewell, and though the moment was fleeting, Clara knew, deep within her, that something significant had begun, a story unfolding not with grand gestures but with quiet, meaningful exchanges, a bond growing slowly yet steadily, promising that the unexpected connections life offered could carry the power to alter everything in ways one might never have anticipated. The days passed with a rhythm that felt both comforting and charged, and Clara found herself anticipating Adrian's visits more than she cared to admit, a quiet excitement threading through her chest each time she heard the familiar jingle of the bookstore door, a sound that had become a signal of possibility, a prelude to moments that were small yet heavy with meaning. And one rainy afternoon, much like the day he had first appeared, Adrian arrived with an urgency Clara hadn't seen before, his coat damp, his hair slightly mussed, and a look in his eyes that hinted at something serious, something he needed to share. He moved toward her with hesitant steps, and Clara, noticing the weight in his expression, felt her heart constrict with both concern and anticipation, wondering if he had encountered trouble, or perhaps carried news that would change the easy flow of their growing bond. "Clara, I need your help," he said, his voice low, carrying the tension of emotions he was struggling to articulate, and she felt a shiver run through her as the intensity of the moment settled between them, an invisible gravity pulling them closer even as they both tried to maintain composure. She guided him to a quiet corner of the bookstore, away from the bustle of the main room, where the light from the overcast sky filtered softly through the windows, casting everything in muted tones, and Adrian began to speak, hesitant at first, then with a slow, trembling honesty, revealing a personal struggle that he had carried alone for weeks, a burden he had hidden from everyone, even those closest to him, and Clara listened intently, her heart aching with empathy, with an urgent desire to comfort him, to offer reassurance that he was not alone, that someone finally saw him fully and without judgment. As his words poured out, the subtle tension in the room thickened, an emotional electricity building with each confession, each pause, each glance exchanged, and Clara felt herself drawn closer, leaning in, both figuratively and physically, to be near him, to bridge the invisible gap that had existed between them since their first encounter, a gap that had always carried a mixture of anticipation, longing, and unspoken questions. Their hands brushed once while she handed him a notebook, a fleeting touch that lingered far longer in her awareness than it did in reality, and in that simple contact, a spark ignited, a quiet recognition of something powerful and undeniable between them, a feeling that both thrilled and frightened her, a delicate tension that neither could name but both understood, the awareness that hearts were beginning to awaken to each other in ways subtle, yet profound. Adrian paused, looking down for a moment, then back at her, his eyes glistening with emotion, and Clara realized that the barriers he had maintained for so long were weakening, that the trust between them had deepened to a point where vulnerability was no longer terrifying, but instead, a bridge to a more intimate connection, one built on understanding, empathy, and the tender pull of attraction that neither could ignore. As the minutes stretched, they spoke less in words and more in subtle gestures, the tilt of a head, the fleeting glance, the softening of expression conveying volumes that their voices could not capture, and Clara felt her chest tighten with a mixture of excitement and fear, knowing that the unspoken feelings that had been slowly growing were now undeniable, hovering between them in a delicate, almost fragile tension, yet one that neither wished to break. Outside, the rain continued to fall, creating a cocoon of sound that made the world beyond the bookstore feel distant, a private space where emotions could surface without distraction, and in that cocoon, Clara realized how much she had longed for this type of connection, how much her heart craved someone who could see her fully, and that Adrian, despite being young, despite the caution their circumstances demanded, was beginning to fulfill a need she hadn't fully acknowledged before. There was a moment of silence, rich and heavy with meaning, and Adrian shifted slightly, his voice barely above a whisper as he admitted fears and doubts he had carried for years, a mixture of insecurity and hope, and Clara, moved by the trust he placed in her, reached out, her hand covering his briefly in reassurance, an act so simple yet resonant, a quiet declaration that she was present, that she understood, that she would not let the moment pass without acknowledging the depth of their connection. Their eyes met, lingering, searching for the courage to admit feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface, and Clara felt a rush of emotion, a mixture of longing, tenderness, and a subtle awareness of the attraction that had grown between them, an attraction tempered by respect and a careful understanding of the complexities in their lives, yet undeniable in its presence, vibrant and compelling. As they continued to talk, Adrian spoke of hopes and dreams, of aspirations he had rarely voiced, and Clara shared small fragments of her own inner life, the quiet regrets, the lingering hopes, the moments of joy and sorrow that had shaped her. And in that exchange, the intimacy between them deepened, a connection formed not only in attraction but in shared understanding, empathy, and the slow unfolding of hearts willing to risk vulnerability. Then, unexpectedly, Adrian laughed softly, a sound tinged with relief and surprise, and Clara joined him, the tension easing slightly, yet leaving behind a subtle, magnetic pull that neither could ignore, a quiet acknowledgement of the emotions threading through the space between them, a dance of proximity and restraint, of curiosity and yearning, of trust and tentative affection. They spoke less formally now, comfortable with silence, with pauses that allowed feelings to breathe and linger, and Clara realized that she had never experienced a connection so layered, so nuanced, so quietly intense, and she felt both exhilaration and fear, knowing that the path forward would require courage, honesty, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. At one point, Adrian glanced at the window, watching the rain streak across the glass, and Clara noticed a shadow of sadness cross his features, a trace of vulnerability he had not previously revealed, and she felt a fierce protective instinct, a desire to be the person who offered warmth and understanding, someone who could help him navigate the complexity of his emotions without judgment, without pressure, simply by being present. Hours seemed to pass unnoticed, and the bookstore, with its familiar scent and muted light, became a haven, a world apart from the outside, a space where two hearts could communicate in ways that transcended words, where subtle glances, light touches, and shared laughter carried the weight of unspoken longing, and Clara felt the quiet thrill of experiencing something profound in what had begun as an ordinary day. Yet even as the closeness intensified, there lingered a hesitancy, a fragile barrier created by past experiences, caution, and the unspoken awareness that life could complicate even the most genuine emotions, and both Clara and Adrian sensed that this moment was pivotal, a turning point where hearts could either retreat or advance, where vulnerability could deepen connection or bring unforeseen challenges, and the tension was both exhilarating and daunting. As Adrian finally prepared to leave, the rain lightening outside, there was a pause, a subtle hesitation, the unspoken question of whether this connection could survive the realities of the world beyond the bookstore walls, and Clara felt a bittersweet ache, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, knowing that the emotions they had stirred in each other were powerful yet delicate, ready to grow if nurtured, yet fragile enough to be lost in a moment of doubt or hesitation. He offered a small, sincere smile, one that conveyed gratitude, admiration, and a quiet recognition of the bond they were beginning to form, and she returned it, her own smile tinged with longing, knowing that life had shifted in ways neither could have anticipated, that the ordinary day had transformed into a moment of emotional significance, and that the threads connecting their hearts were now taut, alive, and ready to weave a story that neither had expected but both felt compelled to explore. And as the door closed behind him, leaving her in the soft, muted light of the bookstore, Clara breathed in deeply, her heart still racing, aware that everything had changed, that a single encounter, a shared confession, and a fleeting touch had altered the course of her days, opening the door to possibility, to longing, to intimacy, and to a story that was only beginning to unfold, one that promised emotional depth, tender connection, and the quiet thrill of discovering that sometimes, unexpected moment truly can change everything in ways both subtle and profound. The weeks that followed felt like a delicate dance, a careful weaving of moments where Clara and Adrian's connection deepened with every shared glance, every lingering conversation, every subtle gesture that spoke volumes, and as the days grew warmer and the rain less frequent, their interactions took on a rhythm that was both comforting and electrifying, a rhythm that carried the quiet anticipation of something transformative waiting just beneath the surface, and Clara found herself thinking of Adrian when she wasn't in the bookstore, her mind replaying moments, the curve of his smile, the gentle inflections of his voice, the warmth in his eyes when he lingered on a story he loved, and she realized that what had begun as curiosity and intrigue had grown into something far more profound, a quiet longing that wrapped around her heart in ways she hadn't anticipated and couldn't ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the soft glow of the bookstore lights mingled with the fading daylight, Adrian arrived carrying a book Clara had mentioned in passing days earlier, his arrival punctuated by the familiar jingle of the door and a warm, almost shy smile, and Clara felt that familiar flutter in her chest, the mix of nervousness and excitement that had been steadily building, a tension tempered by familiarity yet invigorated by the unknown, the sense that every moment together was a thread in a story they were both writing without words. They spent the evening discussing the book, their thoughts flowing easily, laughter spilling between them like a gentle current, yet beneath the surface of casual conversation, a deeper intimacy lingered, a shared understanding that went unspoken, a connection that neither could fully articulate but both felt in the quickening of their hearts, in the quiet pauses that held as much meaning as any sentence exchanged. As the evening wore on, a sudden quiet fell over the bookstore, the city outside hushed by the onset of a gentle drizzle, and Clara noticed Adrian's gaze lingering on her longer than usual, a subtle vulnerability in his expression that pulled at her heart, a reminder of the trust and care that had been slowly building between them, and in that pause, time seemed to stretch, allowing them a moment to exist solely in the presence of one another, the world beyond the walls fading into irrelevance. Adrian reached out, his hand brushing lightly against hers, and the touch was electric yet tender, a quiet acknowledgement of the feelings that had been quietly blossoming over weeks, a promise of intimacy without need for words, a connection forged in vulnerability and mutual understanding, and Clara's heart swelled with an emotion that was equal parts joy, longing, and a cautious hope that this was only the beginning of something enduring. They spoke of dreams, of hopes for the future, sharing fragments of lives that had often been private, and in the exchange, they discovered a remarkable resonance, a harmony of hearts that seemed improbable yet undeniable, and Clara felt a quiet certainty that this bond, delicate as it was, could withstand the tests of time and circumstance if nurtured with care, patience, and honesty. Yet even in the comfort of these moments, a shadow of uncertainty lingered, a hesitation born of past experiences, of life's unpredictability, of the awareness that emotions, no matter how sincere, carried risk, and both Clara and Adrian sensed that to move forward fully, they would need courage, trust, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability without fear, and that understanding added a subtle tension that made their interactions simultaneously thrilling and fragile. One evening, as rain streaked softly across the windows, Adrian took Clara's hand in both of his, holding it gently yet firmly, a simple gesture charged with the weight of everything unsaid, and whispered, "I don't want to lose what we have," and in that moment, Clara felt the culmination of weeks of growing intimacy, the quiet thrill of knowing that her feelings were mirrored, that the connection they had nurtured was mutual, sincere, and capable of blossoming into something extraordinary if given space and care. Her chest tightened with emotion, a mixture of relief, longing, and a tentative joy, and she squeezed his hand in return, a silent affirmation, a quiet agreement to face whatever came next together, and in that simple act, the world outside ceased to exist, leaving only the two of them and the fragile yet powerful bond that had grown between them, a bond of trust, empathy, and an unspoken, growing affection. The rain outside fell harder, yet the atmosphere inside the bookstore was warm and secure, a cocoon of shared presence and emotional resonance, and Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected moment that had first brought Adrian into her life, a single encounter that had slowly evolved into a relationship defined not by grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but by patient, thoughtful connection, subtle intimacy, and the quiet acknowledgement of mutual desire and understanding. They laughed softly at shared memories, reminisced about small incidents and fleeting moments, and in those exchanges, they discovered joy not only in companionship but in the deepening awareness of one another, in the recognition that each was becoming an essential part of the other's life, a realization that brought both comfort and excitement, the sense that love, or something very close to it, was quietly taking root, unfurling in a space they had created together. As the evening drew to a close, Adrian lingered near the door, reluctant to leave, and Clara felt a similar pull, a desire to extend the moment, to savor the fragile, perfect intimacy that had grown between them, and they exchanged a look full of emotion, a silent acknowledgement of what they were feeling, of the unspoken understanding that their lives had shifted irrevocably in the span of weeks, that hearts had connected in a way that could not be undone, that love, patience, and care could flourish if nurtured honestly. Finally, they stepped outside together, the rain gentle now, falling in soft sheets that caught the light of the street lamps, and walked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, each touch sending a quiet shiver through Clara, a reminder that the physical world, however ordinary, could carry meaning when shared with someone whose presence resonated deeply, whose gaze held understanding, whose laughter sparked joy. As they paused beneath the awning of the bookstore, Adrian looked at Clara with a mixture of hope and determination, his eyes searching hers for reassurance, and she responded with a soft smile, a nod, a quiet affirmation that whatever came next, they would face it together, and in that moment, the unspoken tension, the longing, the careful unfolding of emotion all crystallized into a promise, a gentle but firm commitment to nurture what had begun, to explore the possibilities with patience, trust, and courage, and to allow the fragile, tender affection between them to grow into something enduring. They lingered a moment longer in the rain, the world around them blurred and distant, their hearts beating in a quiet sync, each aware of the profound significance of the moment, and Clara realized that sometimes, the smallest, most unexpected encounters could lead to the deepest transformations, that life's surprises, if met with openness and courage, could bring joy, intimacy, and love in ways one might never anticipate, and that this quiet, gentle journey with Adrian had altered her life completely, leaving her with hope, anticipation, and the quiet thrill of a love that was just beginning but already deeply felt, a story unfolding in the ordinary rhythms of life, yet extraordinary in its emotional impact and promise for the future, a reminder that an unexpected moment truly could change everything in ways subtle, profound, and beautifully enduring.